The first time my HOA president called 911 on me, I was standing in my own backyard holding a cheeseburger. The second time I saw him that day, he was pointing at me from behind two patrol officers like he'd just dismantled a criminal organization. What made the whole thing ridiculous was that every single man sitting in my backyard that afternoon carried a badge for a living, including me. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until all of this happened, I honestly thought moving to Willow Creek Estates was one of the smartest decisions I'd ever made. I'd spent almost 15 years living in cramped apartments across 3 different cities. Some places had paper-thin walls. Some had neighbors who thought 2 a.m. was the perfect time to learn drums. One apartment had a water leak so bad I kept a bucket in my living room for nearly 6 months. So when I finally bought my own house at 39 years old, it felt like I'd won something. Not a mansion, not some luxury property. Just a modest 2-story house with a fenced backyard, a big maple tree, and enough space to sit outside without hearing somebody else's television through the wall. For the first year, life was quiet. Exactly the way I liked it. Most people knew me as the guy who waved politely, kept his lawn trimmed, and minded his own business. That changed the day Richard Holloway decided I was a problem. Now, if you've ever lived under an HOA, you already know the type. Every neighborhood seems to produce one person who starts treating the bylaws like holy scripture. Richard was that guy. Tall, late 50s, always wearing polo shirts tucked into khaki pants like he was permanently headed to a golf tournament. The man walked around carrying a clipboard more often than some cops carried a ticket book. He was the HOA president, and from what neighbors told me, he'd held that position for almost 8 years. Nobody challenged him. Nobody argued with him. Most people simply learned to avoid him. Unfortunately, I didn't realize any of that until much later. The Saturday everything started was honestly perfect. The weather sat right in that sweet spot between spring and summer. Warm sunshine, a light breeze, no humidity, no rain. Just one of those afternoons that practically begs you to stay outside. 3 of my closest friends came over, Jake, Ryan, and Marcus. We'd all worked together at different points over the years. Different units, different assignments, different specialties, but we'd stayed close. Getting 4 cops off duty on the same day was nearly impossible, so whenever it happened we treated it like a holiday. By noon the grill was going. Burgers, hot dogs, cold drinks in a cooler. Nothing crazy. No music. No party. Just 4 friends sitting around a patio table talking about life. At one point Jake was arguing that Die Hard was absolutely a Christmas movie. Ryan disagreed so passionately you'd think national security depended on the answer. Marcus kept switching sides every 5 minutes just to make both of them angry. And me, I was laughing harder than I had in months. For once I wasn't Detective Brooks. I wasn't dealing with reports. I wasn't testifying in court. I wasn't chasing suspects. I was just Ethan, a homeowner enjoying a Saturday. Then I noticed something strange. At first it was only a feeling, a tiny shift in the atmosphere. The kind of instinct you develop after enough years in law enforcement. The same instinct that makes you slow down when a parking lot feels wrong. The same instinct that tells you somebody is watching before you actually see them. I glanced toward the fence line. Nothing. A few minutes later I looked again. This time I caught movement. A shadow. A figure stepping away from a gap between the fence boards. I didn't say anything immediately. Neighbors look. People get curious. That happens. But 20 minutes later the feeling still hadn't gone away. In fact, it got stronger. I leaned toward Ryan. You feel that? He followed my gaze toward the fence. His expression changed instantly. Yep. That one word told me everything. He'd noticed it too. Jake was still talking about Bruce Willis. Marcus was trying not to choke laughing. But Ryan and I both knew someone was watching us. Then the side gate rattled. Everyone stopped talking. The latch clicked. The gate swung open. And into my backyard walked Richard Holloway. No knock, no invitation, no hesitation, just straight through the gate like he owned the place. He stopped about 20 feet away and planted both hands on his hips. The man looked like he was preparing to deliver a State of the Union address. Nobody spoke for a second. Finally, I stood. "Can I help you?" His eyes swept across the yard, the grill, the chairs, the cooler, the drinks, the four of us. Then his face tightened. I knew it. The way he said those three words immediately annoyed me. "Knew what?" I asked. "This." He waved dramatically around the yard. "The disturbance." Jake looked around. "What disturbance?" Richard ignored him. "I've received complaints." "From who?" Marcus asked. "That's confidential," Ryan frowned. "We are literally sitting here talking." Richard pointed at the cooler. "You've been drinking." Jake looked down at the can in his hand. "Yeah, it's a Saturday. It's my backyard." "It's one beer." Richard's face somehow became even more irritated. "You people think rules don't apply to you." The phrase landed strangely. "You people." Maybe he meant homeowners. Maybe he meant men. Maybe he meant something else. Whatever it was, the tone wasn't friendly. I tried staying calm. "Mr. Holloway, we're not causing problems." "You don't get to decide that." "Actually, I thought I kind of do. It's my property," but I kept that part to myself. Instead, I said, "You're trespassing." His jaw tightened. "I'm the HOA president. Congratulations." Jake nearly spit out his drink, trying not to laugh. Richard shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Then he looked back at me. "This gathering violates community standards." Marcus blinked. "What community standard says four friends can't sit in a backyard?" Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, then finally pointed toward the grill. "That." "The grill?" "Yes." I stared at him. "The grill is offensive." Ryan looked away because he was about 2 seconds from laughing directly in the man's face. Richard suddenly pulled out his phone. His expression changed. Not angry, confident, dangerously confident. The kind of confidence people have when they're absolutely certain the world is about to prove them right. "You know what?" he said. "I'm done arguing." I nodded. "Great." "No," he smiled. "We'll let the police sort this out." For a second I genuinely thought he was joking. Then he started dialing right there, standing in my backyard. I watched him raise the phone to his ear, watched him take a dramatic breath, and then I heard him say the words that turned a ridiculous afternoon into something much bigger. 911. "Yes, I'd like to report 4 aggressive men threatening residents in Willow Creek Estates." At that moment I looked at my friends. They looked at me. Nobody spoke, because all 4 of us were thinking the exact same thing. Richard Holloway had absolutely no idea who he had just called the police on, and somehow, that wasn't even the craziest part of the story. The sirens showed up about 8 minutes later. Not that I was counting. Okay, maybe I was. There's something weird about hearing police respond to a call that involves you, even when you've done absolutely nothing wrong. Years of training don't erase that feeling. Your brain automatically starts running scenarios. You assess exits, you review facts, you prepare for misunderstandings. Richard, meanwhile, looked like a man waiting for his championship trophy. He stood near the gate with his arms crossed, occasionally glancing at us and shaking his head dramatically as if he were supervising a hostage situation. Jake leaned back in his chair. "I kinda want to know how this ends." Marcus chuckled. "I have a feeling we're about to find out." The patrol car rolled up in front of the house. Doors opened. 2 officers stepped out. One was a younger patrol officer I didn't recognize. The other was Lieutenant Greg Turner. Now Greg and I weren't close friends, but we'd crossed paths enough times over the years. Same department, same training events, same city. The second he stepped through my gate, I saw the confusion on his face. His eyes moved across the yard, the grill, the patio table. The burgers, the cooler, 4 middle-aged men sitting around like they were watching football. Nothing about the scene matched the emergency call. Richard immediately rushed toward him. "Officer, thank God you're here," Greg nodded politely. "What seems to be the issue?" Richard pointed dramatically toward us. "Those men." The younger officer looked over. Greg looked over. Neither one appeared particularly alarmed. Richard continued. "They've been drinking all day, yelling. Threatening residents, intimidating people." Jake slowly lowered his burger. Wow, Marcus whispered. I forgot about the threatening part. Richard kept going. I attempted to peacefully address the situation and they became aggressive. Greg's eyes narrowed slightly, then they landed on me. A second later recognition appeared. Ethan, I lifted a hand. Hey, Greg. His expression changed immediately. Then he looked at Jake, then Ryan, then Marcus, one by one. The realization slowly spread across his face. The younger officer looked confused. Greg looked exhausted, not angry, not surprised, just exhausted, like a man realizing his afternoon paperwork had suddenly doubled. He turned back toward Richard. Sir, do you know who these individuals are? Richard crossed his arms. I know exactly what they are. That answer probably sounded smarter in his head. Greg rubbed the bridge of his nose. No, sir, I mean, do you actually know who they are? Richard shook his head. They're troublemakers. The younger officer shifted awkwardly. Greg finally said it. Sir, they're police officers. Silence, beautiful silence, the kind of silence that deserves background music. Richard blinked. What? All four of them? Another blink. No, yes, no, Greg sighed. Yes. For a few seconds Richard looked genuinely lost, like someone had removed gravity without warning. Then the confusion transformed into anger, pure anger. Because some people would rather double down than admit they were wrong. They're covering for each other. The younger officer looked toward the sky, probably searching for patience. Greg's expression hardened. Sir, did you enter this property without permission? Richard hesitated. That hesitation told everyone everything. Did you enter the property? Well, technically, that's trespassing. Richard's face turned bright red. The younger officer suddenly became fascinated by a nearby flower bed. Greg folded his arms. Sir, they're on private property. They're not violating any laws. They're not disturbing the peace. Richard pointed toward us. They're intimidating me right now. Jake slowly raised both hands. I'm sitting, Ryan added. I haven't moved in 20 minutes. Marcus lifted his drink. I'm aggressively hydrating. I nearly lost it. Greg somehow maintained a straight face. Sir, I suggest you leave. The look Richard gave us before walking away should have come with thunder effects. Halfway through the gate he turned back. This isn't over. Then he disappeared. At the time I thought he was simply embarrassed. I couldn't have been more wrong because embarrassment fades. What Richard felt was something much worse, humiliation. And humiliation has a way of turning reasonable people into dangerous ones. The officers left shortly afterward. Greg apologized for the disturbance. We laughed it off. Or at least we tried. The mood had shifted. Something felt different now. The afternoon eventually ended. My friends went home. The grill cooled. The neighborhood grew quiet again. I figured that would be the end of it. A ridiculous HOA story. Something we'd laugh about later. Then my phone exploded. Notifications, dozens of them, Facebook. Neighborhood app alerts, private messages, comments, mentions. At first I thought something happened in the community. Maybe an accident. Maybe a missing pet. Instead I discovered Richard had spent the entire evening launching a public campaign against me. The first post appeared in the Willow Creek Community Forum. Urgent safety alert. My address was in the first sentence. My name was in the second. By the third paragraph I was apparently running some kind of criminal operation from my backyard. Richard described me and my friends as suspicious individuals, aggressive drinkers, potential gang associates. Threats to community safety. One sentence claimed several neighbors feared for their lives. Another implied police corruption. According to Richard, the responding officers had ignored obvious criminal activity because they were protecting friends. The comments poured in. Some people believed him immediately. Others asked questions. A few defended me, but lies travel fast, especially when they're wrapped in confidence. By midnight there were hundreds of comments. By morning half the neighborhood knew my name, and most of them knew a version of me that didn't exist. The next surprise arrived at 8:15 the following morning. A white envelope taped to my front door, HOA letterhead. I opened it standing on the porch. Violation notice. Then another. Then another. 3 separate violations. one for an unauthorized gathering, one for excessive noise, one for improper outdoor storage because my folding chairs and cooler had supposedly damaged neighborhood aesthetics. I read the letter twice, then a third time. The fines were ridiculous. $100 per day, per violation. I laughed at first, then I stopped laughing because this wasn't about money. This was retaliation. Richard wasn't trying to enforce rules. He was building a case, creating paperwork, manufacturing a narrative. And suddenly that weird feeling I'd had in my backyard came rushing back. The feeling of being watched. The feeling that something wasn't right. I texted the group chat. Within an hour, all three guys were sitting around my kitchen table reading copies of the violations. Jake shook his head. "This is insane." Ryan looked annoyed. "No." He tapped the paper. "This is calculated." Marcus nodded slowly. "He's building a paper trail." That phrase stuck with me. Building a paper trail. Because that's exactly what it looked like. One complaint becomes three, three become 10, 10 become official records. Eventually enough paperwork exists that people stop asking whether it's true. They just assume it must be. I looked through the front window. Across the street, Richard was standing in his driveway, watching my house. Not hiding it, not pretending, just standing there, observing, almost smiling. For the first time since moving into Willow Creek Estates, my home didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a target. Later that evening, Ryan arrived carrying a laptop. He set it on my kitchen table. His expression was serious. "There's something you need to see." The room went quiet. Ryan was the type of person who never spoke dramatically unless something actually mattered. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the screen toward me. "A public records search. Old court documents. Archived case files." At first none of it made sense. Then I saw a familiar name, and my stomach dropped. Not because I remembered the man immediately, but because eventually I did. 5 years earlier I'd worked a major narcotics investigation. One of the biggest cases of my career. Several arrests, multiple convictions, a network distributing fentanyl throughout the county. The name on Ryan's screen belonged to one of the men we'd arrested. A man who later died in prison from a medical condition. I stared at the file, then at the photograph attached to it, and suddenly pieces started connecting, pieces I hadn't even realized were scattered around me. Ryan looked up. "You recognize him?" Slowly, I nodded. "Yeah." Marcus leaned forward. "What does this have to do with Richard?" Ryan clicked another document, then another, then another. Finally, he stopped. The screen displayed a family record, relationship information, names, addresses, connections, and right there, staring back at me, was the answer. Richard Holloway wasn't attacking me because of a barbecue. He wasn't attacking me because of noise. He wasn't attacking me because of HOA violations. The dead man from that narcotics case was his son. Nobody spoke for several seconds. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly, every strange interaction made sense. The stares, the hostility, the accusations, the obsession. Richard had known exactly who I was from the moment I moved into the neighborhood. He hadn't seen a homeowner. He hadn't seen a neighbor. He'd seen the detective he blamed for destroying his family. And now something inside him had finally snapped. Jake broke the silence. "So this whole thing was never about the HOA," I said quietly. Outside, across the street, Richard's living room lights glowed behind drawn curtains. I couldn't see him anymore, but somehow I could feel him there. Watching, waiting, planning, and deep in my gut I knew the worst part hadn't happened yet, because people fueled by anger eventually run out of patience, and when they do, they start making dangerous choices. I wish I could tell you the discovery about Richard's son explained everything and brought the situation to a close. It didn't. If anything, that revelation made the next few weeks make a lot more sense, because once we understood the motive, we started seeing the pattern. And once we saw the pattern, we realized Richard wasn't acting emotionally anymore. He was acting strategically. The man had turned his grief into a mission, and somehow I'd become the target. For the next several days, the harassment never stopped. More HOA notices appeared. More complaints surfaced online. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly looked away when I drove by. A few even crossed the street. One afternoon, I walked into the community mailbox area and two residents stopped talking the second they saw me. You ever experience that? That strange moment when you know people were discussing you before you arrived. Not because they tell you, because the silence tells you. That's what Willow Creek started feeling like. Everywhere I went, silence, whispers, judgment. And the worst part was that Richard never raised his voice anymore. He didn't have to. He'd already planted the story. The community was doing the rest for him. Then things got worse. Much worse. 3 nights after we discovered the connection to his son, I was sitting in my living room watching a baseball game when I heard a loud metallic crash outside. Not a normal sound, not a trash can falling over, not an animal, something violent, deliberate. I muted the television. Another crash. This one louder. My stomach tightened instantly. Years in law enforcement trained certain reactions into your body. Before my brain fully processed the sound, I was already moving. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the back door. The moment I stepped outside, cold air hit my face, and then I saw him. A man dressed completely in black, standing beside my air conditioning unit, swinging a crowbar. The metal housing was already crushed. Wires hung exposed. Pieces of insulation littered the ground. The guy raised the crowbar again and slammed it down. Hard. The impact echoed through the yard. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. The man spun around. For one brief second, the security light illuminated his face. Not clearly enough to identify him, but enough to see anger, real anger, the kind that comes from somewhere deep. Then he ran fast. Before I could close the distance, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a can of spray paint, and sprayed one giant word across the side of my house. Pig, bright red, huge letters. Then he vaulted the fence and disappeared into the darkness. By the time I reached the alley behind my property, he was gone, completely gone. I stood there breathing hard, staring at the damage, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't HOA nonsense anymore. This wasn't neighborhood drama. This was criminal, personal, targeted. Within minutes, patrol units arrived. Photos were taken. Statements collected. Evidence documented. The responding officers treated it exactly the way they should have. Felony vandalism, property destruction, criminal trespassing. As the investigation started, Ryan crouched near one of the footprints left behind in the soft dirt. He studied it for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. "Tactical boot." I looked down. "What?" he pointed. "See the tread pattern?" Jake frowned. "You can tell that from a footprint." Ryan gave him a look. "You can tell a lot from a footprint." A few minutes later he stood. "Size 11, maybe 12. Marcus crossed his arms. "You got anything else, Sherlock?" Ryan's eyes narrowed. "Actually, maybe." The next morning he arrived at my house carrying enough printed documents to qualify as a small library. Coffee cups covered the kitchen table. Laptops hummed. Nobody got much sleep. Ryan opened a folder. "I think I found our guy." The room immediately quieted. He turned his laptop around. A social media profile appeared. Name: Derek Mason. Age: 34. Former private security contractor, former associate of Richard's son, and most importantly, a man who absolutely hated law enforcement. His social media history made that crystal clear. There were posts about corruption, posts about betrayal, posts about loyalty, posts mourning Richard's son. One photograph showed them together years earlier, arms around each other's shoulders, looking like brothers. Ryan clicked another image, Derek at a shooting range. Wearing tactical boots, the exact same model matching the tread pattern found in my backyard. Nobody said anything for a few seconds because deep down we all knew this wasn't coincidence. Jake finally leaned forward. "That's him." Marcus nodded. "Looks right." I stared at the screen. Something about his eyes felt familiar, not familiar like I'd met him, familiar like I'd seen that kind of anger before. Courtrooms, interrogation rooms, victims' families. People looking for somebody to blame. Ryan wasn't finished. "There's more." He pulled up phone records obtained through completely legal methods. or at least legal enough that I didn't ask questions. One number appeared repeatedly. Richard Holloway, long calls, frequent calls, recent calls, very recent calls. Jake sat back. Well, that's not suspicious at all. No, Marcus said quietly, it isn't proof. And he was right, it wasn't proof. It was a connection, a strong connection, but not enough. Not enough for charges. Not enough for court. Not enough to expose Richard publicly. We needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away, something concrete. That afternoon we sat around my kitchen table trying to figure out our next move. Eventually Ryan closed his laptop. We stopped chasing. I looked at him. What? We stopped reacting. Jake frowned. Meaning, Ryan smiled slightly. We make Richard come to us. The room went quiet. I understood immediately. The best way to catch someone making mistakes is often to convince them they're losing. People who feel in control stay careful. People who panic get sloppy. And Richard was obsessed with control. The more we discussed it, the more the plan made sense. Over the next 2 days, I started doing things that would appear completely harmless to normal people. But to Richard, they'd look dangerous. I walked into the local police station carrying folders. Empty folders. I made several visible trips downtown. I met with a real attorney. I let neighbors see it. I let rumors spread. Most importantly, I made sure Richard noticed, and he did, because Richard watched everything. 3 days later, I walked past his property while he was standing outside. I stopped near the sidewalk, never entered his yard, never broke any rules, just stood there. He stared at me. What do you want? I smiled. Just wanted to let you know the investigation is moving faster than expected. The color drained from his face, slightly, barely noticeable, but I saw it. What investigation? The vandalism case. His jaw tightened. I shrugged. They've got some strong leads. For the first time since all of this began, Richard looked nervous. Not angry, nervous. I started walking away, then paused. Oh, and my attorney says the HOA situation is going to get very interesting. I left before he could respond. The second I got home, Ryan was waiting, watching a screen, tracking public activity, monitoring social media, neighborhood forums, everything. He's moving. I dropped into a chair. What? Ryan pointed. He's making calls. Within an hour, one call stood out, a long call to Derek Mason, the exact person we'd been watching, the exact person we suspected. Nobody said much. We simply waited because patience is hard. But impatience ruins investigations. And finally, late that evening, everything changed. A source connected to the investigation provided information that tied Richard and Derek together more directly than any of us expected. Meetings, payments, messages, conversations, enough to turn suspicion into something much more serious, enough to get real investigators interested, enough to start unraveling the entire story. I sat alone on my back patio that night long after everyone left. The replacement AC unit hadn't been installed yet. The damaged siding still needed repairs. The red graffiti had been painted over, but I could still see the faint outline beneath the fresh coat. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, almost normal, but I knew better now. Because sometimes the biggest battles don't start with violence. Sometimes they start with resentment. Sometimes they start with pride. And sometimes they start because one man convinces himself that ruining another person's life will somehow heal his own. Looking back, that's the part I still think about. Not the vandalism, not the false accusations, not even the police reports. What stays with me is the question. At what point did Richard stop grieving his son and start becoming the very kind of person his son used to blame everyone else for being? I still don't know the answer. What I do know is this. The evidence was finally coming together. The truth was finally catching up. And the next thing that happened would bring the entire neighborhood into a room together, where Richard Holloway would no longer be able to hide behind HOA letters, Facebook posts, or carefully crafted lies. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, everybody was about to hear the whole story.